Hi there, Doctor. Good to see you.
Nice to see you both.
Thank you so much for being with us. Dr. Offit, help us understand why the canceling of this advisory committee meeting on vaccines is important, why people should be worried about that, or why it's important to them.
Well, I think what they shouldn't worry about is that there wouldn't be an influenza vaccine this year. There will be an influenza vaccine this year. It will come out on time in September, and it should be as safe and effective as every year. What I do think is worrisome is that this sets a precedent, that our committee meeting, and this is a group of external independent advisors who are independent of the federal government, independent of the pharmaceutical industry, sit around and have an active, vigorous debate about which strains to include. That happens every year. And what I worry is that we are going to be seeing that this is the first of many cancellations of hearings as we simply discard the sort of external advisory board expertise at the FDA or at the CDC.
Dr. Offit, I'm wondering if you can give us and the public kind of a tangible example of the way these vigorous discussions have led to something that the public can imagine or see or feel in terms of public health.
Sure. Well, first of all, they're open to the public. So the discussion that's about to happen now will happen behind closed doors, which is at least ironic given that Robert F. Kennedy Jr. talks endlessly about transparency. But the way this conversation would normally go is we look at a map of the world, we get presentations from the World Health Organizations, the Department of Defense, the CDC. We look at how these viruses move across the world. We look at countries that have winters that precede ours to figure out which strains are likely to come into our country. What's fun about this, or interesting about these kinds of debates, is that we also look at the past year. Did we make the right decision? Did the strains that we picked match the strains that's circulating? If not, why not? And can we do better in the future? I think it's good to have those conversations in public. It's good for the public to hear those conversations.
If the conversations aren't taking place, if there is less transparency, do you think that will contribute to greater vaccine skepticism?
I'm not sure anything can contribute to greater vaccine skepticism at this point. I think people are about as skeptical as they can be. They don't trust the federal government. They don't trust public health agencies like the FDA, NIH, or CDC. I think they hired somebody to head Health and Human Services who has disdain for the agency. I think what's going to happen is likely you're going to see, because you have someone who is the head of HHS, who is a virulent anti-vaccine activist, who is a science denialist, and who's a conspiracy theorist, I think you're about to see vaccines becoming less available and more expensive. And I think that what you're seeing already is the results of some of that, with outbreaks in 9 states of measles, including the first measles death in this country for a child in the last 22 years.
Do you see this as the start of a slippery slope, perhaps?
Yes. Definitely. I think what's going to happen over the next year or 2 or 3 is you're going to see a gradual sort of dissolution of vaccine programs and if anything, greater loss in trust in vaccines, because we now have as someone as head of Health and Human Services who believes vaccines are causing a variety of chronic diseases, including autism, and he's going to do everything to try and create data to support that point of view, no matter how poorly performed those studies are or how confounded those studies are. And that's what I think we're about to see.
Help us speak plainly, Doctor. Is the fact that there is no longer this outside input, either on this vaccine question or perhaps other questions, will it make Americans less safe?
I fear that it might. I mean, we don't have any meetings scheduled for this year, and typically we meet in June to pick the COVID strains for this year's COVID vaccine, and that meeting hasn't been scheduled yet either. I'm worried that the current administration is pushing back on any sort of federal expertise. And if you look at Project 2025, under the section for the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, it says that they want to eliminate the CDC's recommending body. They want to eliminate the CDC as a recommending body for vaccines. They don't want the CDC to recommend vaccines anymore. Just let doctors and parents and patients figure it out for themselves, which would not be a good idea.
Doctor, I'm wondering one more thing here. Did they explain to you why this access to this meeting itself was just canceled? Did they tell you?
We got an email that said it was canceled, not postponed. It didn't say in that email who made that decision or why that decision was made. We're in the dark.
What would your response be to people who say, look, this is just a meeting. Who needs more meetings? Is this making a mountain out of a molehill?
Well, when you have a policy You want to make sure that the science behind that policy is held to a high standard. That's the point of these meetings, whether it's the FDA's Vaccine Advisory Committee or the Advisory Committee for Immunization Practices to the CDC. Those are public meetings, and you can see what the strengths and weaknesses of various recommendations are. So, for example, if you go back to June of 2022, when we considered the bivalent COVID vaccine for use that year, there was a lot of dissension about whether or not that vaccine was of value, and there were definitely no votes. I think it's important to hear that. I'll give you another example. In August of 2021, President Biden stood up in front of the American public and said, as of 1 month hence, in September, we're going to have a third dose recommendation for the vaccine. So he went around those committees. He didn't go through the FDA. He didn't go through the CDC. And when it came to the advisory committees, we voted no. And that was also true for the CDC's Vaccine Advisory Committee. So we rejected what was the executive branch's interest in having a third dose because there was no need for a third dose at that time. It's important to have the administration and these agencies held to the highest standard possible, and that's what these external advisory committees do. You want those external advisory committees because they're independent of the government and they're independent of the pharmaceutical companies.
Okay, Dr. Offit, thanks so much for the insight and perspective.
Thank you.